So remember, we are being empowered all the time to share God's word by learning the story, through learning the story. And remember where we left off last week. We had the dramatic escape of God's people from slavery in Egypt into the wilderness. And I think this, last week we covered a huge swath of history, and we talked a little bit about sort of prehistory and mythic history, and things are going to start to get more tangible as we move forward. So these are some quick highlights, and I trust that you all are going to key in on some themes like you did last week. So these are some questions about. And I'm just looking at the chats. I'm getting the flashes coming in, and I just want to make sure I need to see that. Yeah, absolutely. I can send the slides. I'll send it again. I sent it out last week, and it's all in the Facebook group as well. So things kick off this week with this experience of God's holiness on Mount Sinai, and maybe you found yourself asking lots of questions about that, because in Jesus we have God coming in the flesh, like literally touching, right? And here's a situation where God's holiness is sort of in this cloud on the mountain. And not only were the people not allowed to go on the mountain, they weren't even allowed to get close to the mountain. So there was something about the holiness of God that God was revealing God's self to the people, but that it was very clear that it needed to be handled with care. And so we have Moses' time up on the mountain, receiving the 10 commandments and a lot more of the law, the covenant. And scripture says these tablets were written by God. Meanwhile, down the mountain, if you know this story already, the people are nervous. Where is Moses? Who's going to keep us safe? And so Aaron impulsively decides, well, hey, give me all your gold. And how's that? Give me all your gold, and we'll make an idol. And so Moses comes down to the sound of people worshiping something fake, something that costs them their valuables. And there are a lot of consequences. And we can absolutely talk about those, but, Moses throws the tablets, they break, grinds them up and forces them to drink the powder, right? And then there's this really challenging section of Moses essentially says, who's with me? And the Levites sign up, and they literally kill their brothers and sisters. And then there's a plague that follows. So there's this sense of a dangerous encounter with holiness, and then an even more dangerous encounter by not being able to uphold that connection and that relationship. I called the next part the divine take two, where Moses, again, we get this mystery of God, and I don't want to tangent too much, but this is one of my favorite stories. First of all, Moses is often negotiating with God, right? Like, hey, God, I mean, I know it would be right to punish your people, but imagine how all the other nations are going to think about this. I don't know if you noticed that, but a lot of times, like, what are the other nations going to say? You brought them into the wilderness only to have them destroyed, right? So this is a powerful image too of a human sort of negotiating with God, and God almost kind of de-escalating what would be seemingly a just punishment. And so in one of these negotiations, Moses is yearning to see God, and God's like, nope, the closest you could get is my backside. And I love that image of Moses being in the cleft of the mountain, and God's hand like literally coming and covering Moses until God passes by, so that only Moses can see is God's back. And then it's a new kind of powerful, mysterious encounter. Interestingly enough, the tablets this time are written by Moses. These are the tablets that are carried forward in the ark. And Moses is changed after after this experience, Moses' face shines. And maybe you had a twinge of recognition of that moment of transfiguration, of Jesus being a bright, shining presence on the mountain with Moses and Elijah. So after that point, it's like God's too much for the people, and then Moses is almost too much. He has to put his veil on. So there's some interesting experiences there in the wilderness. When we hop ahead to chapter 6, I did want to point out most chapter 5 is pretty much all from Exodus. Chapter 6 is from the book Numbers, Numbers and then Deuteronomy. I don't know why we use the word numbers in our English translation. The Hebrew is in the wilderness. And so there is some numbering that happens. Like this is where the marching orders and the organization of the people happens as they move forward. But it's also just a great account of more experiences in the wilderness. Like the complaining, this manna is too much. Come on, you provided us, but we want meat. And God says, like, you're going to get so much, you're going to be picking your teeth with it, right? The quail come in. So there's a sense of this repeated dynamic of the people complaining and God providing. But there's a strain. There's a strain that happens. It seems to be the theme is trust, and what we see is how hard it is for the people, especially in such a tense situation. I also listed the experience of Aaron and Miriam, and it mentions that they're sort of jealous and concerned that Moses had a Cushite woman, which would have been a black African wife. So that sort of seems an interesting detail in this time. But there's a little more to it in that there seems to be this sense of how come only Moses gets to have this sort of prophetic power? Why is that not accessible to others? And God kind of puts them in their place, which is really interesting. That's worth spending some time with. What is that about? That Moses is selected and Aaron and Miriam have a role to play, but if it's pushed, there are consequences. So Miriam has her leprosy. Just remember, this is an overview. I'm just going to kind of step through pretty quickly, but again, the trust issue comes up when Joshua and Caleb go to scout Canaan, and it is so abundant that like one bunch of grapes has to be carried on the stick on their shoulders. So there's this abundance that they report back, but they also report, and wow, the people living there are numerous and powerful. And there's some sort of references to the giants that are referenced in Genesis. The people say, no way, we can't do this. And Caleb says, no, we can. We need to trust God. And so there always seems to be the worst punishment for the lack of trust or the lack of honoring the covenant, which actually happens to Moses, not wanting to rush ahead too much. But the people are complaining again and need water. And it's really interesting because the same story of Moses striking the rock happens in Exodus. And it just it's a moment where they're thirsty and Moses takes his staff and strikes the rock and they drink. But in Numbers, there's sort of this consequence for Moses that he arrives there, and instead of waiting for God to reveal what to do, Moses acts. He jumps into action. And so that's the reason that Moses is not allowed to enter into the promised land. That's why he just gets his moment, his peak, his overview from Mount Pisgah. I'm looking at what I put down, and I'm also kind of wanting us to get into our conversation. And so Balaam's donkey always seems like a random story, but it's referenced multiple times in Scripture. And so, long story short, Balak was this king, and he was looking out, facing all of these Israelites coming, and he wanted to hire this prophet to prophesy against them. And Balaam is the prophet that he hires, and Balaam has this adventure with his donkey that is seeing the angel, and Balaam is not seeing. Balaam is just getting to the task and getting ready to do the job, and he's sort of awakened to God's activity, and he pretty much, before the king that hires him has to say, I can't prophesy against these people, Israel. They're going to be victorious. I have to say the word that God gives me. And you can imagine that the king that hired him was not happy with those words. And then last but not least, we see a dynamic that's going to happen again and again. God's people intermarrying with other people. And again, in our multicultural world today, it sure seems like that's what humans do, and it's a beautiful thing. But it's sort of understood to be a way of going astray and being influenced. Not only did those Israelites intermarrying with the Moabite women sort of mingling the tribes, but also they're following those gods. They're following the other gods. And so I lifted up Phinehas, who comes in and one of many gruesome acts, catches a couple in the act, and but there's a zealousy there. I think that's another thing that we may want to spend some time talking about, is sort of these actions that seem to be zealously faithful and loyal to God, but seem also very violent and maybe counter to God as we understand God, especially through the lens of Jesus. The second part of chapter 6 shifts to the book of Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is sort of Moses' summary sermon as he's up on the mountain looking over. And it's a beautiful summary. It's sort of this reminder, like, wow, all these things that God has done for you. Can you imagine, when in all the world did God choose a people and bring them out of slavery and again carry them on eagle's wings and provide for them? So there's a pointing to God, and also I listed the Shema. That's where we hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. That's recited daily by our Jewish sisters and brothers. And of course, when Jesus is asked what's the most important law, he starts with that one. And there's also this sense in the sermon of, God's covenant has been made plain to you in these tablets. So we have the law, and we're going to be intentional about keeping them very close to ourselves, right? There are customs of tying the law, in small scrolls on the forehead or on the arm or on your doorposts. The other dynamic is this, in addition to this invitation to sort of a daily renewal of the law, the relationship with God and the living, but there's also this, what they call the Deuteronomist challenge of, you have before you life or death. So if you choose the covenant, there is abundance and blessing. If you refuse or choose another relationship, there will be curses and consequences. And that's where, Deuteronomy just kind of lays that out. And that is actually a big frame for the rest of, mostly, I would say, the Old Testament, but also like our human hardwiring, right? We have this deep-rooted sense of choose the good and good will follow, choose the bad and there are consequences. And so that theme comes up again. When we get into the prophets, we're going to hear, okay, because Israel is oppressing the poor, because Israel is following other gods, there are consequences, right? That's why Babylon is knocking on their door. So this is sort of the beginning of that sort of blessings and consequences, sort of just kind of clearly laid out. Chapter 7, if it's okay, I'm gonna just look at the chat later. Joshua, I'll confess to you, this is sort of one of my most complicated scriptures in seminary, because essentially it doesn't. When we hear about the promised land, the land of milk and honey, it's not a fairy tale that's just revealed to the people. It is a land that is occupied by multiple peoples, and it requires a military invasion. And that is how that's essentially what's happening in Joshua. There's this command to be strong and courageous. I had hoped that Ellen Edgar was going to be on our call tonight because she loves Rahab, the woman of the night that helps those spies, those Hebrew spies, get an entry point into Jericho. And I don't know about you, but man, my childhood Sunday school days were all about blowing the trumpets and the walls coming tumbling down. So that was one military strategy. And then of course we hear this like genius plan when they invade Ai, when they're sort of outnumbered and the city's in lockdown. They pull some great military strategy to get to take that city. And it's interesting, we can talk more about some of the violence. And actually, I mean, this is really hard stuff when God says, hey, I want you to like literally kill everything, right? I mean, like, whoa. And in fact, sometimes people are punished when they say, well, I'm going to kill all this, but I'm going to keep this for me, right? Like that is seen as a punishable offense. And so there's this tension of struggling and on the one hand, these whippersnapper Hebrew people coming into these established kingdoms, but the kingdoms are kind of getting afraid the more they hear about this. And there's also this like yearning for rest. We're going to hear that refrain again, that there was rest from war, that the land had rest. So there's this sense of striving and struggle and this desire for peace. Joshua wraps up with a really, Joshua gets his own summary sermon, which I never realized, which is just it's a lot shorter than Moses's, but it's sort of the journey so far. And this commitment, that, you're going to, in this new land, there will be other gods. And as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. And then, of course, chapter 8, a few good men and a few good women. This is the time of the judges. And so this is sort of the time after the conquest of the land. And the tribes are more or less kind of living in the area. And these judges emerge, these sort of wise people. That do their best to kind of guide, judge, fight when needed. But we keep hearing again and again about the people following what's right in their own eyes and following the local gods. Baal and Ashtaroth get a lot of press in these, and they were the popular Canaanite gods of the day. It's kind of refreshing to hear about Deborah in this list, a judge not only who was a ruler but also who went into battle, and we can leave out the gory details of that battle. We sort of see I just got a visual there. We also sort of see this decline in the judges, like when you read the book. The early judges start out good, but man, they just kind of keep the bar keeps getting lower and lower. So even Gideon, I kind of loved Gideon. It was like, are you sure, God? Like one more thing? Like, are you sure it's me that you're calling? And how about we try the fleece a different way, right? So Gideon, he's not sure, but then he has this great battle. I always love that scene where he weeds out the ones that are going to go to fight with him by how they go and drink water from the stream and lap it like a dog. But even Gideon goes off track in the end. He kind of wins peace, but then he sets up his own little temple. And when we get to Samson, who again gets a lot of, we like to talk about Samson and his strength, but I just spent some time studying him lately. I mean, it's this great example of dissipating God's power and gifts, right? Like he's given God's spirit, he's given God's strength, and he's spending it impulsively running after women and getting vengeance, and again, it's just sort of this fascinating human tragedy of Samson. And it's kind of, when I grew up, I was like, oh, those Philistines, Samson's standing up to the Philistines. And now I'm like, man, Samson, whoa, like what you could have done with what you were given. So that's where we're going to end this week, right? Next week, we're going to hear a little bit about Ruth, which is actually, I was thinking about how the placement of that after those Moabite women, right, who were pulling God's people astray, and that Phinehas, kind of stomped down that activity. But then we hear Ruth, and then we see the people starting to head into the direction of the monarchy period. So thanks for hanging in there. I'm gonna stop the screen share and unmute people and check out the chat. I'm gonna stop this recording too, so we can just flow freely.